The desert was wide enough to hold secrets and yet quiet enough to make them echo. At dusk, the horizon bled into rose and copper, and the land carried a stillness that seemed eternal. Wind shifted through the sagebrush, whispering in a tongue older than men, carrying both memory and loneliness. A single figure moved against that canvas of silence. Her shadow stretched long across the dry earth, like a brushstroke drawn by the setting sun. She was 23, and though her face held the softness of youth, her eyes carried the heaviness of survival. Her name among her people meant Willow Bend, for she had learned to bow without breaking, yet few remembered to call her by it. She had walked the borderlands between two worlds, Apache blood in her veins, but white men's towns rising around her like fences of iron. In both places she was watched but not seen, spoken of but never spoken to. She wore her hair in dark braids that reached down her back, tied with scraps of cloth she had dyed herself. The dust on her boots told stories of miles traveled, of nights beneath unpitying skies, and of mornings where she had risen with no one waiting to share bread or voice. Her heart longed, not for riches, not for a roof, but for the quiet weight of belonging. She wished for laughter that reached her ears as though it knew her name. She wanted someone to sit beside her when the fire cracked low and the night seemed endless. Yet in her silence she told no one, and so the loneliness grew like a wild vine across her ribs. It was in a town whose main street was lined with saloons and half-broken porches that she thought she had found something close. A man had ridden in weeks before, a ranch hand with shoulders broad as the barn doors he mended. He looked at her as though she were made of glass, delicate, precious, worth protecting. For a while, she let herself believe him. His hands were rough, but they rested against her cheek as if he feared she would vanish. When he spoke, she leaned in, aching to catch every word, convincing herself that maybe this was safety at last. But time is a ruthless judge. The tenderness faded, his voice hardened, and the sweetness that once lit his eyes gave way to something hollow. He grew impatient with her silences, dismissive of her quiet strength. One evening, when she spoke of dreams, of family, of children not yet born, he laughed, not cruelly but carelessly, as though her yearning were a foolish game. That night, sitting on the back steps of the saloon, she realized the truth. He had never seen her at all. To him she was a passing comfort, not a forever. Love, she understood then, without respect is an emptier loneliness than solitude. She rose the next morning and left without farewell. The road was kinder than a heart that had no room for her. Days later, as autumn's breath chilled the evenings, she found herself wandering toward a weathered barn on the edge of the prairie. Smoke rose from a small fire, and the faint smell of coffee drifted through the air. A man sat there, a cowboy not much older than her, his hat tipped low and his back curved as though bearing years heavier than his age. His horse grazed nearby, dark against the fading light. He was not handsome in the way of storybooks, but there was a steadiness in his presence, like the river that cuts stone not through force but through patience. He noticed her without staring, offered her a seat without asking questions she did not yet know how to answer. The flames flickered between them, drawing shadows across his face. When he spoke, his voice was low, calm, a rhythm that soothed rather than startled. He told her of long trails, of nights where the stars were his only companions, of mornings where silence had been both friend and foe. She listened, and for the first time in years, she felt that silence did not accuse her. Instead, it welcomed her into its fold. The fire snapped, and a spark rose into the night sky like a fragile wish. She studied him in the dim light, searching for the cruelty that hides in most men, but found none. His eyes, gray as distant storms, held no demand, no judgment. Only patience. He did not press her for her past, did not question the scars hidden beneath her quiet, only sat with her as though her presence itself was reason enough. The night stretched on, and though few words passed, something shifted within her. It was as though the walls she had built against the world grew softer, not crumbling, but allowing the possibility of a doorway. She felt her chest ache, not from pain, but from a sudden, fragile hope. Her hands trembled slightly as she held them close to the fire, and in that small tremor was the weight of years spent carrying loneliness like a stone. She looked at him, at the lines of his face lit by firelight, at the curve of his shoulders where strength and weariness met. And in the hush of that moment, so soft she wondered if the night itself would swallow the sound, she whispered words she had never spoken aloud, words that tasted like confession and surrender all at once. "I don't want to live alone anymore." The fire crackled as though it had heard her. He lifted his gaze, steady and unreadable, and the silence stretched, heavy with possibility. She waited, heart pounding against her ribs, uncertain whether she had just planted the seed of something new or doomed herself to another wound. The night held its breath. And that was when his lips parted, though the words had yet to come. The night after her confession hung heavy with silence. The words had slipped from her lips like stones falling into a river, and she waited for the ripples to come. He did not answer at once, only stirred the embers with a stick, eyes tracing the sparks that rose into the dark. She thought perhaps he had not heard, or worse, that he had heard and found no reply worth giving. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, and yet she sat, unwilling to flee from this fragile moment. In the days that followed, something began to take shape between them, not with grand declarations, but with small gestures that spoke louder than words. At dawn, he saddled his horse with a care that seemed ritual, and when she lingered near, he handed her the reins as though inviting her into his rhythm. He did not instruct, did not mock her inexperience, only guided her hand when needed. Their mornings became a dance of simple tasks, mending a fence, carrying buckets, patching holes in the barn roof. Work that should have been dull became a language of companionship. The widow from town noticed them once, and with a knowing smile, she placed a loaf of bread into the girl's hands, as though blessing what was quietly blooming. Side characters brushed against their lives like passing breezes. A ranch boy of 15 ran errands for the cowboy and often lingered by the fire, wide-eyed with stories he begged them to tell. He admired her strength when she lifted a pail heavier than he could manage, and she smiled for the first time in weeks. The boy's laughter softened the edges of her guarded heart, reminding her that even the lonely could weave themselves into a tapestry of others. Yet, within her, the river of fear still ran deep. One evening, as the wind carried the scent of rain, she watched the cowboy from across the fire. He was sharpening a blade, the rhythm steady, unhurried. His presence was calm, but she could not silence the question rising within. What if he left? What if his kindness was temporary, like a passing season? The first man had promised warmth, only to grow cold. How could she trust again without bracing for the sting of abandonment? The storm broke on a night when the sky was swollen with stars, brighter than lanterns, as though the heavens themselves leaned closer to watch. They sat side by side, the air crisp, their fire crackling against the chill. She felt the weight of unshed words pressing at her chest. Her hands twisted in her lap, and her voice, when it came, trembled like the wing of a bird. "I am afraid," she said softly. "Afraid of being left again, of opening myself only to find emptiness. Afraid that I am too much burden, not enough blessing." The silence that followed was not cruel. It was vast, like a canyon, holding the echoes of her truth. He laid the blade aside, eyes lifting toward the constellations. For a long while he said nothing, and she feared she had spoken herself into ruin. But then he turned to her, and his gaze was steady, unshaken. "I have walked long roads," he said, voice quiet, carrying the weight of his years. "I have known nights where the silence was my only company, and mornings where the emptiness at my side was louder than thunder. You are not a burden. You are the answer to what I have been searching for without knowing." Her breath caught, as if the stars themselves had leaned closer to listen. He leaned in slightly, not with haste, but with reverence, as though every inch mattered. The fire painted his face in gold and shadow. His words came then, not grand, but simple, the kind that could anchor a wandering heart. "Stay forever." The words struck like lightning, not with violence but with illumination. She felt the ground steady beneath her feet, as though for the first time in years the earth had chosen to hold her. The tears came then, unbidden, hot against her cheeks. She did not weep from sorrow but from the release of it, the dam within her breaking. His hand found hers, rough with calluses, warm with promise. He did not pull her close, not yet. He simply held her, and in that stillness was more intimacy than any embrace she had known. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain across the plain. The stars seemed endless above them, the fire dimming to embers. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart still racing but no longer frantic. The boy from town would find them in the morning, side by side, their silence no longer lonely but full. The widow would smile, seeing what had taken root. The land itself seemed to exhale, as though acknowledging the bond now sealed. And deep within her, where once had lived only the ache of solitude, there blossomed something fierce and tender. It was not sudden fire, not the blaze that burns bright and dies quick. It was ember, steady and enduring, capable of carrying them through the winters ahead. For the first time in her life, she believed she was no longer a shadow between worlds, but a woman seen, cherished, chosen. And though the night stretched on without end, she knew this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning.